a lumber camp on the upper southwest Miramichi. In the center of the floor between the bunks is a big rammed-down wood stove, and around and over this stove is the drying rack, filled with the day's quota of steaming wet mittens, pants, shirts, socks, and larrigans. Nearby, directly under one of the lamps, the men have set up the grindstone, and a small group is gathered round it, working or waiting their turns. Others are seated along the deacon's seat, talking or tending to their own affairs. Heavy socks, wool pants, suspenders, brightly colored shirts, red underwear, all are dressed in some variation of this uniform. Some wear their hats, many are heavily bearded, all are dead tired from a hard day's work in the woods. It is not far from lights out. A man in a black sweater yawns and starts to stretch. Then he stops midway. "Hey, Fred," he calls, "give us a song." "Hell," Fred answers from the grindstone, which he is turning for another man. "I sang last night. Get that new fella. Maybe he's got something we haven't heard more'n 100 times. "You've heard every one I know 1,000 times, says the new man, "and you don't want to hear me sing. Come on, Fred, give us the Lost Jimmy Whalen again." Several others look up and add their voices to the request. "Well," says Fred, "I don't mind. Wait a minute." He finishes his turn at the grindstone, walks over to the deacon's seat, and sits down. Then he leans forward, elbows on knees, one hand holding the back of the other, and looking at a point on the floor about 5 feet away, he begins to sing. "Slowly I strayed by the banks of the river, a view in those roses as evening drew nigh." On and on it goes, the voice clear and strong, speeding up and slowing down, holding notes unexpectedly, hitching, adding little graces here and there, filling the whole camp with that strangely beautiful song that better than any other seems to express the cold loneliness of the winter woods. All is still, save for that voice. Hello, my name is Ian, and today we're talking about Edward D. Ives, Sandy Ives, Lumbercamp Singing, and the Two Traditions. This is a very short article from at the time, a reasonably obscure publication. It's almost like a note rather than a full article, and it is remarkably important. Sandy Ives was his life's work. He did other very important things as well, but his life's work was really about understanding the singing traditions of the lumber woods of Maine. It's what drew him into folklore to begin with, and he had a remarkable apotheosis, an epiphany, perhaps better. Yes, not an apotheosis, he had an epiphany when he made the what is now a self-evident discovery, but at the time sort of rattled him and rattled what he understood as being the nature of folk song, and unseated him from his English literary background and towards his career as a folklorist, which was understanding that folk songs were not creations of some undifferentiated throng, but were the deliberate creations and recreations of songwriters and performers, that they enter into traditions. And he started his work by examining a songwriter from PEI called Larry Gorman. And Larry Gorman is what I just read to you is the beginning, the prologue to his first book, Larry Gorman, The Man Who Made the Songs, which was basically based on his dissertation from Indiana University, and it came out in the early 1960s. But Gorman actually wrote songs, was known for writing songs, and he was a legendary figure in and of himself, that there are stories about him and his songwriting, and particularly because he wrote scathing satirical songs that were deliberately aimed at people like various workers, various foremen that he didn't like, or the companies that they were working for. He had this reputation of wit and cutting wit that put the songs that he created into context. So other people would sing his songs as well, and they entered into these traditions. And so Ives focuses on how singing actually happened in the lumber camps, and that they took place, unlike other work traditions, some forms of field work or working on the sea, for example. Singing does not accompany work. This is not lumbercamp singing is not like a sea shanty or a field holler where a song is being used in part to coordinate rhythm, to establish, or jodying in military contexts, where it's helping to coordinate the rhythmic syncopation of workers together. In addition to it being entertaining, in addition to it being a way of passing the monotony, or at least alleviating the monotony of work, it is also a way of using rhythm and so on in order to heave away and haul away and all those things that work songs often do. Lumbercamp singing doesn't take place in those contexts. Lumbercamp singing was basically a way of entertaining the self, entertaining one's fellow people, and typically, but it was lumber, as you can imagine, being a lumberman was a hard kind of labor, and it didn't even necessarily take place on weeknights, because weeknights were, even though there was no work going forward, the just resting up, just preparing for the next day, and drying out of clothes, and drying and sharpening tools and so on for the next day was just laborious. And it was, Sunday being a day where they wouldn't do work, Saturday night became an important night for entertainments and a way of entertaining themselves. Singing was just one of the ways that the people might entertain themselves and entertain each other in the lumber camps. But singing was certainly a prominent one. And that's an extension of Saturday night as being a time of leisure. Of course, throughout Atlantic Canada, throughout Maine, throughout North America. Basically, as long as we have a 7-day work week and we have the idea that Sunday is a day of not work. It's a day of rest. It might be a day of going to worship, but it is not. It's not going to be gearing up for hard physical labor the next day. Saturday night becomes this time of leisure. And so he describes the singing habits that there's the performance of reluctance, like, I don't know if I can, my voice is hoarse, you don't want to hear what I will have to sing. And with that play, as it were, those scripts of reluctance and then finally convincing, that therefore demanded a certain amount of additional attention and almost reverence when singing actually did happen. So, and it wasn't accompanied. There weren't songs that were choral. They weren't songs that people joined in on the refrains. They were solo songs. And what's more, people had a sort of ownership over particular songs. Only particular people had the, as it were, the right. It was in their repertoires, and they would sing certain songs, and other people would sing certain other songs. And so even, if it was a song they liked, like The Lost Jimmy Whalen, and a person had a reputation for it, that would be the person who would sing the song. And it's all part of, again, not simply the Saturday night leisure, but the idea that this is basically continuing patterns that would have been consistent around the Maritimes in their home communities, including men singing songs. And this is where the article goes from being a description, an important description, but moves away to a really interesting concept, this two traditions. And it's not the two traditions in terms of Maine and the Maritimes, although, within the Maine woods, Maritime singers had this reputation for an interesting repertoire. And so, in part because of all the connotations that Atlantic Canadians might have, even in as parallel a situation as Maine in terms of an interesting background, a reputation for tradition, and all those qualifiers of sort of that sort of half reverence and half belittling that happens about Atlantic Canadians in general vis-a-vis the maintenance of traditions. But what the article is basically saying is that his concept of the two traditions has to do with this public versus domestic traditions, which are largely contiguous with male and female traditions of performance. And it has to do with how men's work operates and women's work operates. And that men's work, like the lumbercamps, and the lumbercamps might be an example in extremis, but they're interesting, is that it tends to be periods of intensity, sometimes solitary labor, but labor that takes place away from home. And also, not simply away from home in terms of going to the lumber camps, but even in one's home community, leaving the house and going into the fields or the forests or the sea or whatever. It takes place outside of the immediate domestic sphere. And it's typically fairly physically demanding, labor intensive, as we might say. And then because of patterns, for the day-to-day patterns in terms of the sun setting, and month-to-month, year-to-year patterns in terms of weather, weather and the patterns of the sea catch, the patterns of when to cut down trees, the patterns of when to till fields, and all those things. There are times when the work is very intense throughout the year, and there's times when it is less intense. But men's work has typically had this, or men's life has typically had this distinction between times of work and times of leisure. And so within those leisure times, there is things to fill. And we don't want to dismiss the idea that those times of non-intense work also had times of less intense work, like fixing nets and so on. An often regular part of both evening wear, like in his example of sharpening grindstones and so on, but also of as I said, fishing nets, fixing nets in fisher contexts and so on. But it's less intense, and they might be communal, and there might be things that are accompanying other work, but also it's just none. Also a distinction between sort of public space, in that during these times of leisure, men might leave the home, go to the pub, go to a friend's house, go to the post office or the corner store, and just congregate. And that's what they do. When they have nothing else to do, they go hang out. And then they are filling up their leisure time with whatever it takes, whatever is happening. Could be storytelling, could be exchanging news, could be a whole bunch of things, and often it is some kind of performance of story or performance of song. And so in the performance of song, they are performing in front of other men, not exclusively men, but often in front of other men. The other performers will mostly be men, and there will, because we enter into this world of serious leisure. He uses an expression that's similar to serious leisure. But the idea that, okay, I am now in the public sphere and I am now singing, and there is going to be status accorded. Status accorded a certain form of competency, but often not status accorded having this distinct repertoire. Singing songs that other people don't sing, bringing new songs to the fore. And so, again, the way that people have a certain ownership over repertoire, they still don't necessarily, after a while, they don't want to exhaust that repertoire. So there is a value about expanding one's repertoire, whether it is through composition, which is a rarity, but does happen, or whether it is through discovering new stuff. And here's where that tradition enters into the Lumbercamp tradition, in that you have the Lumbercamps become this remarkable conduit for how new songs enter in, because you have people from communities all across Atlantic Canada, men from these communities all across Atlantic Canada, who hang out on Saturday nights, who sing in this public tradition and so on, develop this reputation, have learned songs even just passively from their home communities, and they sing these, and whether they sing these songs or whether they know these songs is, they might know these songs because they listen to them, but they don't have the ability to perform them because that repertoire is sort of someone else's. Then they go to the main woods, and they sing these songs, maybe the ones that they've sung before, maybe these other songs that are coming in from their home communities that would have been someone else's in those contexts, but now they are theirs in the main context, and they have status and reputation and within that particular matrix of the Lumbercamp. And they also hear new songs from other men who are singing in similar contexts. They're from their home communities, and boom, and then they go back to their home communities, and then they're singing songs, and some of the songs that they're singing that they can now claim ownership over are these songs that they learned in the Maine woods. So this actually answers the academic question of how songs spread. And through the camps, it's not the exclusive one, but it's remarkable how potent it was. Through participation in the camps, you had songs entering into the repertoires of a whole host of communities across Atlantic Canada. And so, prior to these kind of revelations, the question is, well, how does a song enter into a community? And how do songs spread? How do stories spread? And we sort of kind of go on this basis of osmosis. Well, a song happens, and then and what Ives is basically doing is developing this kind of actual sort of social network theory, and that they're generated in these particular contexts, and then there are these nodes, the camps in Maine and in New Brunswick and all the lumber camps, but his particular focus is on Maine, and where people from all over this region converge, bringing their community stuff, and they are literally in this specific performance context, and the weeks and months that they are in the woods, they perform, and they learn these songs. They both have their own active, each individual lumberman has their own active repertoire of the lumbermen who sing, but each have their own active repertoire, and they are learning others, and then boom, they come to these other communities. And so within a year, a song can be composed in Prince Edward Island, it could be brought to the lumber camps, and then all of a sudden everyone's singing it across Atlantic Canada, and it answers this question. And that is one of the traditions. And then the second tradition is this domestic tradition, and that has to do with women's labor and women's singing. Because women's labor is not outside of the home in the same way that men's labor is. There is participation in the local, in the participation in crops, and participation in the preparation of perhaps what is like the main form of male labor. So women will often participate in doing things like salting fish and drying it and storing it and so on. And there's a lot of work, but they're also as much, if not more, responsible for the domestic economy, the home, perhaps the gardens, horticulture, but taking care of children, sewing, all those things. And that work doesn't stop. That work doesn't have that clean distinction between hard labor and idleness or relative idleness. It also doesn't necessarily have the luxury of, during periods, whatever idleness there is, of going out into some kind of public sphere and participating in these public song traditions. So women's singing traditions tend to be more domestic. And he knows exactly that he is speaking in generalizations, and he has all the warnings about the generalizations. So don't be angry at me, and don't be angry at him. He's aware that he's talking in broad strokes, so allow it to talk in broad strokes, because he's not diminishing either of these. He's basically saying that these are consequences of the ways that work has been divided. He's not saying work ought to have been divided. He's not saying work naturally should be divided this way. He is saying work has been divided this way, and that therefore and this is an interesting consequence of that, because women's singing tradition doesn't have that serious leisure idea. It doesn't have that reputation and status being accorded on a breadth of repertoire. So women's song traditions, they tend to be narrower in scope. because there isn't this almost, it's not the word, professional is not the word, but there isn't this requirement, there isn't this status according desire to develop as broad a repertoire as possible. So they're not constantly learning new songs. It's also singing that accompanies other forms of work. So it's singing while sewing, or while doing dishes, or while cleaning. There's a documentary that has some wonderful footage of, it's called Sign a Wish. It's a documentary by Helen Creighton, and she is collecting from a woman outside of Halifax, and this is like the strange 1950s documentary, so it's perhaps a contrived circumstance, but it's not her actual field work, but almost like a reproduction of her field work. But nevertheless, the woman who she is collecting from can't really sing unless she's cleaning the floor. So she's down there, she's scrubbing the floor while singing the song. 1950s contrivance perhaps, but a good indication of how women's song tends to be performed. The audience is narrower. The audience is the immediate family, perhaps. And the audience would be children. And as boys start to, and their labor responsibilities start to take them outside of the home, and girls remain in the home and start following the domestic labor expectations. The boys had been exposed to their mother's repertoires, and then basically they enter into a male repertoire tradition. The girls learn their mother's repertoires, and so on. So there's this matrilinear genealogy of repertoire. So women's repertoires in the Maritimes and parallels elsewhere tends to be narrower but deeper, not as broad, not hundreds and hundreds of songs, but long form of generations back, because they are learning the songs that have been in their mother's repertoires, which were in turn in their grandmother's repertoires for X number of years. And so when people are interested in collecting the old songs, as it were, most of the old songs, most of the child ballads that have been collected in Atlantic Canada are from women informants, women singers, because that's where they have. Now, there is crossover. Those young boys who learned their mother's repertoires, who might not have much need for their mother's repertoires in their home communities. They might grow up and go into the Maine woods, and all of a sudden they can bring those songs, and those songs are new, and they will be in their own particular idiosyncratic repertoires there, and then that's how they bring them into performance traditions, that male public performance tradition in the lumber camps over here. And even if they're not necessarily performing them back home, and so they still exist. So these two traditions, what Ives basically did is he sort of identified these broad patterns. And again, they're not hierarchical. Just because one is broader does not mean, because he's like broad but shallow, and narrow but deep. Are the two. And one, the seriousness of it has to do with the privilege to be serious in one's performance competencies, that the patriarchal spillover of how domestic labor is divided. And so that's sort of a legacy. A modest warning before we leave the subject of the two traditions. We should not expect anything like a dichotomy or a polarity. I doubt that the distinction was ever consciously maintained to begin with. It's just the way things worked out. There is a good deal of similarity in sharing. We are not surprised to hear women singing songs they learned from their menfolk, and if I am right, the child ballads are essentially women's songs. We shouldn't be surprised to find men a little scornful of them. But songs flowed both ways. And Bill Cramp's story of how he learned his favorite song, "The Old Elm Tree," from his sister, not only shows that, but is a nice example of domestic tradition with which to close this part of the discussion. I was going by the house this evening. She was to her supper dishes. The door was open, and I could hear her singing that song, and I thought that was the prettiest tune I have ever heard. I walked right up within a few rods of the kitchen door and sat down there and listened to it till she finished that song. I knew if I let her know I was there, she wouldn't finish it. So, this modest note, which then turned into a chapter in his book on Joe Scott, who was another of these lumberman songmakers. So, through his book, it might have had a bit more of a reputation, but this is basically his first public display of it. It forces us to just ongoingly remember that these are consequences, that folk performances exist in very specific consequences, including gendered politics. So his work sort of forced this reevaluation of how repertoires develop and spread. They're not accidents. They're consequences of history. They exist within specific moments. How the repertoires are gendered. Child ballads is women's song. Well, what comprises women's song and why? Why is women's song a category of sometimes derision? And is it a category of derision because of the quality of the song? Or is it a category of derision because the songs that comprise a women's repertoire will not necessarily help one attain status when status is accorded by virtue of breadth and novelty as fundamental categories and fundamental values, which are only fundamental categories within specific performance contexts. That they're conditioned by who is present and who is absent at particular performances. When I am singing, what am I trying to achieve? Do I have an, I don't want to use a word that, don't want to quite use the word agenda, but do I have a rationale for choosing the songs that I choose? And is one of those rationales status, that I will be accorded a particular tip of the hat for having songs that meet some perhaps elusive but nevertheless shared criteria. And that how the conditions of labor, so again his sort of his reevaluation, how the division of labor conditions leisure, and thus the ludic contexts of expressive culture. So much of what we do takes place in leisure time. Much of what folklore study takes place in these times between, when we have time to express ourselves expressively. Even the study of work lore and labor lore is typically the things that happen in coffee breaks or at retirement parties, or at times where we're not actually doing the work, because actually doing the work is not necessarily the best time to be engaged in expressive performances. That's the point. So, folk expression doesn't just happen, it occurs within the flow of actual, practical, lived experience. We know that, but when we're not reminded of it, then we default to this idea of the folk almost being beholden to their repertoires, that they're just this happy-go-lucky people who have this wonderful set of stories and perpetuate them, as opposed to these intelligent, creative people who do have repertoires and who creatively and intelligently and with discernment and with judgment and with sharp criteria perform or reperform and create and recreate within specific contexts We just have to keep remembering that. Because otherwise we will just slip into fancy. It doesn't do anybody any service. Anyway, I'm going to stop talking now. This is, one of the best things you'll ever read in your little lives. This is Sandy Ives, Lumbercamp Singing and the Two Traditions. My name is Ian, and as ever, my friends, I wish you nothing but the absolute best. Take care.